Hello viewers, welcome to the course on Jurisprudence 1. I am Dr. Simranjeet Kaur, Professor of Law, City University, Ludhiana. Today we will talk about the Jeremy Bentham's theory of utility and its merits and criticism. So let's start with the introduction of the topic. Since developing consciences, humans have struggled with the idea of good and evil. The area of the law of philosophy known as ethic is concerned with organizing, defining and suggesting ideas of proper and improper behavior. To better understand human morality, ethics aims to define ideas like good and evil, virtue and vice, justice and crime. In political theory, utilitarianism is a moral and ethical philosophy. Even if there are traces of its classical Greek philosophy, Jeremy Bentham and J.S. Mill's contribution helped us to popularize it. The initial part of the 18th saw a significant application of this idea. The primary tenet of utilitarianism is greatest happiness to the greatest number. Nowadays, the majority of nations operate their political, economic and social systems based on the fundamental premise of utilitarianism. Despite being main proponents of the utilitarian notion, Bentham and J.S. Mill differed in certain aspects of their methods. Utilitarianism is one of the most powerful and persuasive approaches to normative ethics in the history of philosophy. Though not fully articulated until the 19th century, the pro-utilitarian positions can be discerned throughout the history of ethical theory. Though there are many varieties of the views discussed, utilitarian is generally held to be the view that the morally right action is the action that produces the most good. There are many ways to spell out this general claim. What distinguishes utilitarianism from egoism has to do with the scope of the relevant consequences. On the utilitarian view, one ought to maximize the overall good, that is, consider the good of the others as well as one's own good. The classical utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham and the Stout Mill identified the good with the pleasure. They also held that we ought to maximize the good, that is, bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. Jeremy Bentham is considered as the father of the utilitarianism. Bentham was an English philosopher born in 1748 into the family of the lawyers and lived during the time of the major social, political and economic change. He himself was a lawyer, though he never practiced the profession. While he was in the process of joining the profession, he became dissatisfied with the British law and took it upon him to reform the system. In an introduction to the principles of moral and legislation published in 1789, Bentham wrote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do." This formed the starting point of this inquiry and the foundation of this theory. Bentham strongly said that man's life always lies between two different masters, like pain and pleasure. Moreover, Bentham said that pain and pleasure can be measured through arithmetical method and there is a possibility for quantitative difference between pain and pleasure. J.S. Mill is the strong supporter of the utilitarianism and individualism. Mill, in his explanation, he poured a midway between utilitarianism and individualism on the modern basis. Mill explained that difference between pain and pleasure can be measured through quality measures. Essentials of the theory. Utilitarian is the theory of morality that advocates the action that fosters happiness or pleasure and opposes the action that causes unhappiness or harm. When directed towards the making social, economic or political decision, a utilitarian philosophy would aim for the betterment of society as a whole. Utilitarianism would say that an action is a right if it results in the happiness of the greatest number of the people in the society or a group. Utilitarianism is a theory of morality that advocates action that fosters happiness and oppose action that cause unhappiness. Utilitarian promotes the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. When used in a socio-political construct, utilitarian ethics aim for the betterment of society as a whole. Utilitarianism is the reason-based approach to determining right and wrong, but it has limitations. Utilitarianism does not account for the things like feelings and emotions, culture or justice. Utility principle. Utilitarianism is an English philosophy. It is a theory of morality. It is a tradition of ethical philosophy. It advocates action that foster happiness or pleasure and opposes actions that causes unhappiness or harm. When directed towards making social, economic or political decisions, a utilitarian philosophy would aim for the betterment of society as a whole. It would say that an action is right if it results in the happiness of the greatest number of the people in a society or a group. Utilitarianism considers the interest of all humans equally. Though utilitarianism is one of the most powerful and persuasive approach to the normative ethics in the history of philosophy. But this concept was not articulated until the 19th century. The consequentialist ethical theories which assist an individual's act based on their effect included the notion of utility, which was introduced by the Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was innovative in that he placed more emphasis on the results of a behavior than the motivations for it. He thought that good deeds would have positive results and that intentions were meaningless. He suggested that the quality of the pleasure and pain resulting from the effects of our activities ought to be the most crucial factor to take into account. To put it simply, an action is considered good if it brings about pleasure and bad if it brings about pain. An action is either commended or condemned based on the idea of utility. However, the principle of utility is different from egoism, which endorses pleasure of oneself. Utilitarianism provides that one should pursue pleasure, not just for us, but for as many as possible. Bentham stated that we should act always so as to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. A utilitarian would therefore sacrifice their pleasure for the pleasure of the group. Bentham created the utilitarian celsus to add into the calculation pleasure or pain. The individual action is to be judged on the elements, namely intensity, duration, certainty and propinquity, whether the pleasure will come soon or will it be delayed pleasure. Further, in order to calculate for the actions classified as a certain types, then two more elements needed to be included, namely fecundity. Does the actions have any secondary pleasures And purity, does it have any secondary pains? Moreover, when considering action for the groups, one more element is added, and that is extent, number of people affected. The largest benefit to the largest number. The most crucial Bentham utilitarian formula is this one. It is this theory's main concept. Every government must enact measures that have the potential to benefit the greatest number of people. A government that functions to benefit a small number of people is not at all a good government. It is an oppressive and unjust administration. The maxim, the greatest good of the greatest number, is therefore the universalistic and charitable concept. Bentham clarified that the formula of the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the correct response with the pleasure of a person on the one hand and the happiness of many on the other. Bentham regarded state as a law-making agency. According to him, the state is a group of persons organized for the promotion and maintenance of happiness, but for this end it acts through law. By means of law, the state rewards or punishes so that the happiness is increased and the pain decreased. According to him, the law should take cognizance of bad actions and inflict punishment on the people, so that the net balance of pleasure is increased and that of pain decreased. Mere morality is not sufficient, and unless law comes into operation, bad things cannot be out of place. Only law, being the command of the sovereign, can secure habitual obedience of the people. Bentham did not believe in the concept of interest of the group. He instead held that the interest of the group is sum of the interest of the individual, and that group do not exist independent of the individuals. Moreover, he proposed that as the main consideration of the theory is suffering, all persons are equal when calculating the pleasure attached to the action. Merits of the basic utilitarianism is the soft act version. These are the theory's central advantages. The first one is clarity and simplicity. In general terms, it's easy to understand the idea that we should all act to increase the general welfare. The next one is acceptability. The idea of bringing the greatest good to the greatest number coheres with the common and popular ideas about what ethical guidance is supposed to provide. The next one is flexibility. The weighing of individual action in terms of their consequences allows for meaningful and firm ethical rules without requiring that everyone be treated identically, no matter how different the particular situation. So, the students whose scores were suspended by the college board could see them reinstated, but that does not mean the college board will take the same action in the future. If, say, large number of the people start stealing test booklets, breadth, the focus on an outcome as registered by the society overall makes the theory attractive for those interested in public policy. Utilitarianism provides a foundation and a guidance for the business regulation by the government. Let's discuss the limitation of the utilitarianism. In the workplace, though utilitarian ethics are difficult to achieve, these ethics also can be challenging to maintain in a business culture where a capitalistic economy often teaches people to focus on themselves at the expenses of the other. Similarly, monopolistic competition teaches one business to flourish at the expense of others. A limitation of utilitarianism is that it tends to create a black and white construct of morality. In utilitarian ethics, there are no shades of gray. Either something is wrong or it's right. Utilitarianism also cannot predict with certainty whether the consequences of our action will be good or bad. The results of our action happen in the future. Utilitarianism also has a trouble accounting for the values like justice and individual rights. For example, say a hospital has 4 people whose lives depend upon receiving organs: transplant, a heart, lungs, a kidney and a liver. If a healthy person wanders into the hospital, his organs could be harvested to save the 4 lives at the expenses of this one life. This would arguably produce the greatest good for the greatest number, but few would consider it an acceptable course of action, let alone an ethical one. So, although utilitarianism is surely a reason-based approach to determining right and wrong, it has obvious limitations. Criticism of this theory: there have been a number of criticisms of Bentham's principle. The principle, as expounded by the Bentham, came to regarded as act utilitarianism or classical utilitarianism. One objection to the principle was that it justified any crime and even made it morally compulsory in order to achieve the satisfaction of the pleasure for the greatest number. Burne Williams presented a thought experiment as a criticism which involved Jim, a botanist, faced with the choice of killing one prisoner for the release of others or death of all 20 prisoners. He rejected the theory on the basis that any system that exacts immoral acts and reduces moral decision to mere algorithm is incompatible with morality. He cited that utilitarianism requires the killing of the prisoner. The trolley thought experiment, which involved deciding between killing 1 or 5 persons by throwing a switch to divert a trolley car, and a physician thought experiment which required a physician to kill 1 healthy person to save the life of 5 terminally ill patients by performing organ transplant, demonstrates that theory in a manner justifies any criminal activity, genocides, murders or endangering life for the benefit of others. Another complaint presented was that the theory is impracticable. The theory assumes that an individual has sufficient times, information and knowledge to calculate the consequences of an act, evaluate their worth and make comparison with other alternative acts before taking actions. Alternatively, a critique stated that theory failed to recognize other motivations that guide human action. By focusing the theory on simple pleasure and pain, devolves human thinking to animalistic needs. As a corollary, Karl Marx in the Das Kapital criticized utilitarianism on the ground that the principle failed to afford attention to the phenomena that people from the different socio-economic context perceive joy differently. Furthermore, Pope John Paul II argued that utilitarianism is a civilization of a production and of a use, a civilization of a things and not of a person, a civilization in which a person are used in the same way as things are used. Therefore, utilitarianism tended to make the people similar to the object of use. A prominent criticism was the failure of the principle to distinguish between the well-being of the stranger and that of known persons. And therefore, the principle ignores our special obligations. Any act where one prefers a close relative over a stranger shall be an immoral act under utilitarianism. Roger Scrout criticized the theory does not give duty a place inside our ethical judgment. Peter Singer, a modern-day utilitarian, answers that the question, however, is not what we usually do, but what we ought to do. And it is difficult to see any sound moral justification for view that distance or community membership makes a crucial difference to our obligations. Furthermore, some critics have raised some demandingness objections, which states that combination of equality with the greatest good for the greatest number places unreasonable demands on an individual. The huge number of the people and the indefinitely many opportunities to make sacrifices to help them would require a person to sacrifice a lot and remain in a constant state of hardship and self-denial. According to the Hooker, this is the wasteful, as such sacrifices shall only result in a slight increase in the aggregate good. The principle of utilitarianism opposes retributive theory and states that rational punishment is to prevent further crime. It emphasizes formulating better policies and making informed decisions, as the first priority of the government is to maximize the happiness, that is, for the benefit for the greatest number of the people from the programs and the policies, and at the same time minimize the pain, that's losses and damages. It also helps in formulating policies for the welfare of maximum number of the people with quick implementation. It also supports democracy as a way of making the interest of the government coincide with the general interest. In a concluding remarks, utilitarianism has profoundly impacted the modern society and its law. Utilitarianism was radical in the sense that it is theory that is aimed at defining one simple basis that can be applied when making any ethical decision. Criticism has not diminished its importance. It is important to understand utilitarianism as it forms the basic tenets of the legal theory and function of laws. It assists in developing policies by examining their consequences and ensuring it touches the greatest number of people. The theory informs debates on social issues and is the foundation for the modern animal rights campaign. Utilitarian approach to the political obligation demolished the theory of divine rights, natural rights, and social contrast. This concept placed the individual before the state. It is altruistic but not egoistic. At present, the concept of utilitarian become the core concept of all legislations. In fact, the present democratic government based on the principle the greatest happiness to the greatest member, though the concept is not free from the lacunas. They can be reduced in implementation of the principle. So, viewers, that was all for today. We will discuss more topics on the jurisprudence in the forthcoming videos. Thank you for watching the program.